the whatness of what a human being is, can be, according to Plato's writings, can be decided objectively by appealing to intuitions we have. Some earlier scholarships called those intuitions innate knowledge. That can be misleading, because it's more like the modern scholarship comes and sees in it as a kind of, how should I say, intuition that we all share, that are there, and we just need to come out in dialogue more and more. So both the who and the what, so far, as a first step, have been sort of communicated. And are there any questions before I go on? Step into the Platonic writing is that a human being is having all the knowledge in himself or herself, but that very few know about that. And in order to now switch a little bit and show Plato's affection for Socrates, we have to go to Delphi. Delphi is a sanctuary in the north of Greece, close to Corinth. Some of you may have been there. Delphi is a place where the people went to had important decisions coming their way, and it was a temple. The temple had, on the left side, it had an inscription, know yourself, as the ideal of the human being, know yourself. And on the right side, it was written, never too much. So the combination of this, know yourself and never too much, creates a very interesting virtue in Greek life, which is called sophrosyne, and that means moderation. Everything in moderation, you have heard about that. But anyway, a friend of Socrates went there for a decision that he had to make in his personal life. And he came back to Socrates and said, listen, when I was talking to the Pythia is the priestess at that sanctuary. And that priestess, takes all the questions in during the evening. Then she goes and sleeps over it overnight, and in the morning comes out and dishes out these answers to individuals. They are little oracles, but the individual still has to make his or her mind up what it all means. But anyway, he comes back to Socrates and say, hey, Socrates, listen, the Pythia, the oracle said that you were the wisest human being in the universe. Big shock, Socrates, naturally in full irony here, when how should I say, this text is put in the mouth of Socrates again. Full irony, what, me? I know I practically don't know anything, etc. So he then develops a praxis to go to the agora, which is the marketplace, and questioning people about what they know in order to defeat the oracle of Delphi and prove once and for all that he, Socrates, knew practically nothing, while all these other people, they knew plenty. So he goes first to talk to the politician, and very quickly find out the politicians don't know what they're doing. And so he's astonished. So he goes to the poets and realized, these wonderful poets, Sophocles, wonderful, they create these incredible emotions in human beings. It's beautiful just to listen to them, but do they know anything about why we are here? What our purpose is? Or anything? No, they really don't know that. So he finally went to the engineers, all the people who organized, built houses, etc. And while they were perfectly in building houses and tubes and whatnot, streets, whatnot, they didn't know what they were doing in the first place either. So you get the gist. The Socrates found out that however much they knew, these individual groups of people. They really didn't know what they didn't know. And that is a curse. So he came to the conclusion, Socrates, with the little I know, practically nothing, I know, at least I know that I know nothing. And it is this complete reversal that serves as an entry into my going now into a first demonstration of what it means to be a human being. And I thought it would be nice if I would focus a little bit on a little writing. The dialogue is called The Symposium. Most of you probably know it. It's a little dialogue containing about 7 speeches of individuals. Plato, Socrates obviously is one of them. And what they talk about is the beautiful. All right. So they want to talk, I mean, it's typically Socratic dialogue again. I mean, what is beauty is topos of that little writing. So they start out saying, well, first of all, you know, what is beauty? Beauty is, first of all, something that awakens in us a certain love of things. Okay, the love of things is called eros. So I love. So the first sort of speaker lays out what such a love can mean: the love of a partner, the love of food, the love of a good horse, the love of whatever they could get their hands on, the love of money, etc. And they say it's really this kind of love that propels people to be who they are on the lowest level of the scale. So what we are witnessing now in this little dialogue is the sort of a second wave of definitions of what a human being is. And that is that a human being is really a kind of love. It's loving, it's eros. So what do we love? Well, again, it starts out with the sensory, kind of nice little exchanges of love. And then the second speaker, he sort of moves up the rail a little bit. I mean, it happens to be Aristophanes, the speaker. He's a sort of a comic in Athens. He has written 3 plays where he mentions Socrates, by the way. And that's contributed to the fact that Socrates is indeed a historical figure. Anyway, Aristophanes then says, having recourse to the humorous little myth about that the original human being has been double, 4 sets of arms, 4 sets of legs, and all of that. And that they were kind of, how should I say, a little bit silly. And when Zeus saw that, he said, hey, I want nothing of that. I need some moderation here. He took a knife, a sword, and cut that human round being in half. And that would then be explained, that would explain why each human being searches his or her complement in another human being. So speeches of that sort go up and up the line. And the next speaker is sort of a medical person. Very interesting also because there was this controversy between the temple medicine and since Hippocrates lived around 500 BC, and those 2 ways of treating medicine were in conflict in Athens of that time. But here we have a speaker, Eryximachus is his name. He clearly is a scientist. He is on the side of Hippocrates, and he says, look, when it comes to love, you have to realize that everything in the universe is connected with everything else. You cannot just take a little slice of here and then think, yeah, this is answering your question of health. No, you have to take into account the nature of the physical universe, the nature of living beings, the nature of what is going on here, not just in Athens, but in everywhere in the then known universe. And so and there are other speakers, but finally Socrates is about to speak. And he thinks naturally, when Socrates speaks, he wants to lift the entire notion of love on an intellectual level. All right. Now, what does that mean? Well, it would mean that you first of all have a standard of what it means to love. What's the standard? Is it to find in the sensory world? Is it to be found elsewhere? And again, Socrates says it has to be found on timeless principles. That's a sort of an ongoing thread in the Platonic writing. Principles that are not subject per se to time and space. They are subject to time and space insofar as they show themselves in time and space. But Socrates pretty much runs out of steam. And so he tells a story about a woman. Her name is Diotima. She comes from the north of Greece, in a region of Thracia. And they have levels of knowledge that the Greek have not yet achieved. And she starts now telling, through Socrates' mouth, a story that brings you to the highest principle of what love really means. And on that highest principle of what love means, it means oneness. The principle of oneness, of ever widening the circle of what you mean by one. And that then creates the question, what do you mean one? And here is a very, very interesting thing. A moment in the writings of Plato where you sort of stop and say, yeah, what's the one? And then you realize that Plato has spent his youth with the mathematician Pythagoras. And Pythagoras held that the number one appears on two levels. It appears on a temporal space level, like one fork, one knife, one animal, one tree. We all seem to know what we mean by one. And perfect. It's part of a mathematical system, number one. But then he found out from Pythagoras that there is another level to one, where the one does not appear. Because the one is then that which holds everything else together. So when it comes to mathematics, you could say, well, I mean, you have the number one, it's visible. 1 versus 2 versus 3, yeah? Perfect member of the series. But what holds the whole of the mathematical system together? That's the one. And once you intuit that, you first have an inkling what Plato may have meant by reaching the highest level of of knowledge. He aims at that standard of oneness that does not become visible. When it becomes visible, it's an application of the principle. And so that sort of explains a little bit what Plato means, or at least I should say his writings in Socrates' mouth, by saying, look, we have to reach the highest knowledge when we discuss what is beautiful. And what is really beautiful is the oneness of things, and this oneness is ever more expanding. And etc. So the question then now becomes, well, on what level of oneness are you situated? Or do you feel one with your family? Okay, it's good, no problem. But it's not enough. Yeah, well, okay, the oneness with whom? Yeah, well, with your society. Okay, yeah, it's not enough. Well, what? The oneness with your cosmos? Oh, yeah, it's good, it's not enough. So what is enough? Well, nothing is enough. That's eros. It is the love. You're looking for it. And so Socrates makes it very clear that when you're looking for the perfect knowledge, etc., you're looking for it. You don't have it. It's a forever looking, etc. Nobody can put these things, and say, okay, now I know. No, there's no such thing. And so I sort of compare it, if you want a little contemporary image of this in physics, it would be how physics is forever looking at a theory of everything. I mean, as you know, Einstein started out looking for a unified theory because what needs to be unified is gravity, and then the non-gravitational forces like, let's say, atoms and molecules and all of that. They haven't found it, but they're looking for it. Now that is a perfect example of what Plato means by looking for ever wider unity, to figure out things. But the key of that is that which gives the unity is not itself a member of the visible kind of order that you want to establish. My dear fellow speakers or listeners, we have so far covered two things or three into finding out where that vertical ladder is coming from in Plato. This, he has a lot of little myths. The cave is one of them, which is called the divided line is another one. So little mythological narratives, which maybe we could explain or we could consider at another time, because our time is expiring tonight. And if you are still awake, I congratulate you. Is there any final question on you? I would also like to talk with you a little bit about the monstrous side of arguments. I mean, Plato was proposing a program of eugenics. Pretty awful proposal, I have to tell you. He was also formulating a theory about the abolition of the family. Make the proposal that we take next time the question up about Socrates' death and about how death is part of this larger unity to our lives in many ways, has to be lifted up to the level of the intellect as non-temporal principles. Maybe we can find some clarification there too. And then we also have to maybe go into the nature of the soul. We can go into what you called, rightly so, Wilhelm, his element of totalitarianism, his complete failure in political life. He failed miserably, Plato did.
Yeah.
When he tried to give philosophical advice to Dionysius over in Italy, in Sicily, But,
Eugen, I have a final question. First of all, thank you so much. It's a wonderful way of doing this, and you have a great style in doing it. The final question, with everything you've shared with us and everything you know about that and the human being and what it means to be human, and you connect that to the current situation we're experiencing, does that make you an optimistic or a pessimistic person?
Whoa, what an interesting, fascinating.
It's a simple question, come on.
Well, let me give you an answer out of Plato's own writings. The older Plato, who wrote the Laws, the Statesman, he is completely disgusted by de facto human nature. Completely. He sees corruption everywhere. So the difference between a prescriptive theory of what a human being is, a standard, and what a human being turns out to be factually, that tension is an eternal tension, I think. And so, on the one hand, I am a pessimist about humans being who they are, showing themselves to be globally in a variety of ways overall. But on the level of, how shall I say, standard, my own standards, personally, or Socrates' standards, Plato's writings, the standard of what a human being ought to be. Okay, there I'm a complete optimist. Because you can see factual situations that speak to both situations. And the coronavirus environment is precisely a good point. You see enormously good people. And you see already scams, you see already evil people who try to make financial profit out of the misery of others. So pessimism and optimism, I think, should join. I mean, you shouldn't be a relatively naive optimist like the younger Plato was, nor should you be sort of a bitter, disappointed, cynical pessimist. You should try, in the topic of tonight's lesson a little bit, to find the unity of both. Okay?